Hello, and welcome to this episode of Peace in the Time of the Pandemic, a summer video short series of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, part of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. I'm Erin Corcoran, the Executive Director of the Kroc Institute and Associate Professor of Teaching at the Keough School. Today, I am joined by Bill Frelick, Director of the Refugee and Migrant Rights Division for Human Rights Watch, which monitors, investigates, and documents human rights abuses against refugees, asylum seekers, and other internally displaced persons, and advocates for the rights and humanitarian needs of all categories of forcibly displaced persons around the world. Bill has spent his professional career advocating for the fair and humane treatment of refugees and other forcibly displaced individuals, and has also been a tremendous role model and mentor for advocates like myself. So thank you for being here today, Bill.
Thank you for that, Erin.
Currently, there are over 70.8 million refugees and forcibly displaced individuals who have fled their homes and often homeland in search of protection. Unprecedented numbers of refugees and internally displaced persons are fleeing war and genocide, ethnic and religious hostility, structural violence, and increasingly environmental harm caused by climate change. And now these refugees are also facing the effects of the global coronavirus. So I wanted to start our conversation by briefly talking about historically, even before this global pandemic, refugees and other forcibly displaced persons have lived in a tremendous amount of insecurity and faced real barriers to truly rebuilding their lives once they have fled their homes. And I'm thinking in particular about the lack of resources that they have, including food, shelter, sanitation, as well as permanent legal protections from harm. So I was hoping you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the foundation of the refugee reality, which is a lack of state protection. That's what causes people to be refugees in the first place. Either their own governments are persecuting them, or their governments are failing to protect them from other actors who are doing serious harm to them, gangs in Central America or whatever it may be. And so people that generally, say I have rights because I'm a citizen and my government supports me and protects me. People that are either internally displaced, they've had to flee from one part of their country to another because they can't be protected in their homes or their home areas, or they've had to cross an international border and put themselves on the mercy of the international community in a way that basically is a pure human rights concern, because without your government there to protect you as a citizen, you're basically calling on the international community and whatever the host government is of the place where you are located to ensure your rights as a human being. Um, and of course, what ends up happening, even though human rights, generally speaking, many of the same rights that citizens have should be the same rights that other people have just as human beings. In fact, in practice, that's often not the case. We see marginalization of stateless populations and generally of refugee populations as well, that are restricted in their freedom of movement, restricted in livelihoods. And so things where you might be able to become self-sufficient if you had a recognition of your rights to be able to move freely and to be able to work and this kind of thing, you create dependency basically by restricting people's rights. And then we get into the discussion of whether there's enough shelter and food and the kinds of things that you mentioned, particularly in protracted situations where people are warehoused in one manner or another, not allowed to work, not allowed to move, and then you have what's often called compassion fatigue, where the international donors give less and less money to the humanitarian appeals, and rations are cut, and populations grow in these confined places, and social dysfunction becomes worse and worse, and the situations fester, and we're left with really bad situations that if you had treated rights in a more respectful way at the outset and had searched for durable solutions, either resettling people to third countries, to finding real solutions in the countries of origin that enable people to go back home in safety and dignity and voluntarily, or to integrate them in ways that when at the height of an emergency, where it may be appropriate, to hold people temporarily, to assist them and to protect them. Over time, that those kinds of restrictions become less and less tenable, and we should be looking progressively in protracted situations for how you can integrate people socially, economically, and ultimately politically, so that they have the same civil rights as the people in the host country.
And so, just talking a little bit more about that and these sort of what are now very protracted situations for refugees, is sort of they're being held in camps or and in some instances in the United States, detention. So what are those conditions like for those refugees on the ground in those places?
Yeah, well, there are very different, approaches in different parts of the world and different countries. So, and just in your question alone, you mentioned, detention centers, and you mentioned camps, and when you look at the millions of refugees around the world, most of them are neither in camps specifically or detention centers. They're oftentimes in slums. They're, in a sense, not provided with accommodation, whether a forceful accommodation in the form of a detention center or not. They're basically left to essentially defend for themselves in many cases, and they end up in the poorest, most squalid areas, where they are living in unhygienic conditions and great difficulty and poverty in many cases. But then you do have camp situations where there's an attempt usually to segregate people, oftentimes into remote areas of a country that don't have arable land, that are, the sort of the wastelands, if you will, of a country. I think of the Dadaab camp in Kenya, which is, way up on the border, the middle of nowhere, for mostly Somali refugees, land that really had no particular use for anyone else. And since the early 1990s has been home to, 250,000 or more, mostly Somali refugees that are restricted to that camp, and they're not allowed to work, and they're basically segregated there. Um, and similarly, the Cox's Bazar camp, the largest refugee camp in the world currently, in the Kutupalong camp in Cox's Bazar for Rohingya refugees, it's been there for a shorter period of time, basically since the large camp, since the expulsion of the Rohingya in August and September 2017. But there again, they are, first they were restricted to the Cox's Bazar district, or the sub-district in which the camp is located. But more recently, the authorities have been building a barbed wire perimeter around the camp to prevent people from leaving. And what we've seen under COVID-19, for the first time, the transfer of refugees from Kutupalong to this island, in the Bay of Bengal, which is created from silt from the Meghna River. It's a very unstable island that's subject to being inundated. And for the first time, they've moved several hundred of the Rohingya refugees to a new camp on this previously uninhabited island. And we're quite fearful that, of course, right now with cyclones hitting the region as well, that this could really be seriously dangerous for people. And yet it's being done in the name of COVID-19. It's being done as a sort of what is purportedly a quarantine measure, but with no indication whatsoever that once people are put onto that island, they're going to be allowed to transfer off the island, or that there's any meaningful way of sustaining their lives on that island. I mean, thinking in terms of education and healthcare and this kind of thing, livelihoods, but even just maintaining them maintaining, fresh water and food and this kind of thing under these circumstances is very difficult and extremely isolating for people who depend on the support of their own communities, which they did in Myanmar and continuing in Cox's Bazar, and now to put them in this isolated island where they're really stuck it's a microcosm for what we're seeing in many places around the world, which are various efforts to restrict the movement of refugees, to segregate them, and whether, again, we could talk more specifically about migrant detention centers, where the idea is basically to detain people with the idea of holding them so that you can deport them, if they are found not to qualify for refugee protection, or these other situations where oftentimes when you have masses of people and you don't have individualized asylum procedures in place, you're just warehousing people and waiting for, again, one of those durable solutions to occur. Countries holding out hope that they'll be able to repatriate people back to their home countries, but in fact, that oftentimes is not a viable alternative.
Well, great, thank you. And I think that just is a nice segue to sort of the next part of the conversation I wanted to talk with you about, and that really is the global pandemic and COVID-19. And you've already alluded in some ways to how that is continuing to exacerbate an already fragile state refugees and forcibly displaced individuals face. But I'd also be interested in you talking a little bit about how nation states have maybe changed their treatment of those seeking protection during this pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple trends going on, some of which appear, sort of look a bit contradictory on their face. Um, uh, One of the main concerns that we have is simply blocking refugees at borders, or I should say asylum seekers, these people who are seeking to enter, seeking to lodge claims to be protected, fleeing the burning building, so to speak, at that point. And basically governments, including the US government, I think leading the way in some respects, basically using COVID-19 as a pretext to close off the border and to basically say you're not allowed to lodge an asylum claim and we're just going to push you back. And so what happened to the United States is using Centers for Disease Control basically as um, the I would say the pretext for what the government has been trying to do in the previous several years, to block asylum seekers and to prevent asylum seekers from lodging claims in the United States. And we can go through, specifically the steps that had previously been taken to do this, through what are called the migration protection protocols, to have people remain in Mexico while their claims are pending in the United States, or metering them so that they are bottlenecked and can't actually lodge claims at ports of entry. And then at this point, and other other similar kinds of barriers that have been thrown up pre-COVID-19, and now with COVID-19 basically saying that non-essential travel to the United States, across the land borders, is barred, and people will not even be detained. They don't go into ICE detention, where they would have the opportunities to be put into something called expedited removal, where they would at least have some kind of a chance to lodge a claim for protection against removal. They are, held by Customs and Border Protection, not transferred to Immigration Customs Enforcement, and they are expelled summarily without being able to lodge asylum claims, either to their home country or to a third country, in this case Mexico. Or there's also something called the Asylum Cooperative Agreements with Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, where you can send third country nationals to those places, to have their claims adjudicated there. We just did a report on that last week. I could talk about it in more detail. But the main point here, the main point that I'm trying to make, is that you're using essentially public health concerns, which are legitimate concerns, but you're ratcheting them up and weaponizing them in a sense, in order to take, blatantly unlawful approaches in the treatment of refugees. And I think just even the notion of what's essential travel here, really puts a point on it, because the CDC order, you know, addresses commercial travel. It addresses student travel as essential travel that are exceptions to this broad-based ban on non-essential travel. It actually doesn't specifically address the right to seek asylum at all. It doesn't address asylum seekers. It's not. It's so inconsequential from the way that this is framed, that a person that's basically saying my life is in danger, there's a threat against me and I need to be protected by another country, is considered to be non-essential. And what we've been trying to argue is that, the right to seek asylum, the right not to be returned to a place where your life would be threatened, is as essential as travel can ever be. And that it is possible, in fact, it's completely manageable, to address legitimate public health concerns and the right to seek asylum at the same time. These are not irreconcilable imperatives, if you will. So in no way are we dismissing the public health concerns. We are quite sympathetic. Myself, I don't want to be, infected with a disease any more than anyone else. So, we all want rational, evidence-based public health measures, including quarantining people as necessary and proportional. But that doesn't, excuse ham-fisted approaches that completely disregard both the health rights and the human rights of migrants and asylum seekers themselves, which gets into the second issue, that you raise here, which is the question of detention and detention of migrants and asylum seekers both. And if I could address that just briefly. So here, what I said is sort of the contradictory or counterintuitive things. There has been more releases of people from migration detention worldwide, and these are oftentimes court-ordered releases, where the courts have basically said that you're subjecting people to unnecessary exposure to this pandemic by holding them in unsanitary conditions, overcrowded conditions where social distancing isn't possible, and basically you can't do that. And there have been judgments, recent judgment in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights dealing with, I think it was Panama, basically ordering release of migrants from detention there. We've seen similar orders in the European courts, and here in the United States as well, similar kinds of orders here. But at the same time, the resistance to that is also evident, and there are two things that are going on that I think are worth mentioning. One is that in many places you have a suspension of asylum procedures. So, the idea that you're holding people who might be seeking asylum or wanting to lodge asylum claims, but at the same time you're not processing those claims, means that you're holding them and you're not giving them an opportunity to mount a defense against the reason that you're holding them. And in addition to that, for people who aren't asylum seekers, who have exhausted their domestic remedies, as it's sometimes called, they've gone through the process, they've been found not to qualify for protection, or they didn't apply for asylum at all. People that are in deportation proceedings, who are actually deportable people, lawfully could be removed. In many cases, those deportations themselves have been suspended because countries are not willing to take people. Airlines are not willing to take them. We've already seen in the case of the United States, people held in immigration detention centers here in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, contracting COVID-19, not being tested properly for it, and then being deported. We have three cases, deportations to Guatemala, to Haiti, and to Mexico, where people have tested positive in all three of those countries after having been deported from the United States. So the United States is introducing COVID-19 into Haiti, for God's sakes, and so, Haiti's basically saying, no, don't do this. So if deportations cannot be executed, lawful deportations cannot be executed, then the reason, the legitimacy of administrative detention for the purposes of removing people evaporates. And so here again, you have to sort of tease this out legally a little bit. When you're looking at migration detention, we're not talking about people who have committed a crime, they're being sentenced for a crime, they're being punished for the crime. You're being held administratively, in order for the government to remove you. And so the foundation of administrative detention, migration detention, is basically, it has to be a legitimate aim, which deportation can be a legitimate aim. If it's lawful, if people have had the opportunity to plead their cases, whatever they may be, for protection or whatever else, whatever claims they might have, they've exhausted those claims, they've been given a fair opportunity, then you can remove them. But the detention has to be proportional to that legitimate aim, and it has to be necessary to that aim. And generally speaking, detention of asylum seekers, and I would argue migrants, should be as a last resort, when you can't find other alternatives in order to execute that aim. Well, if the aim itself if the aim itself is not possible, then then it's not necessary, it's not proportional to realize an aim that can't be realized, and people need to be released on that basis. And here I think we should get into the real discussion ought to be alternatives to detention. What are both humane alternatives to detention and safe ones, so that if you have to quarantine people for public health reasons, you're doing that, you're managing this in a way that's responsible. But at the same time, there is a government interest, that's a legitimate government interest, in removing people that don't have a right to remain, and to ensure that that there is adequate supervision, and that people will end up showing for their proceedings, and ultimately for their removal if that's deemed to be legitimate, and it is something that even we as human rights advocates, we recognize that governments have their own sovereign rights, if you will, and their responsibilities, and we function within that system.
So do you think, perhaps, given these court decisions that have come down, sort of showing that it may not be necessary for the government to detain someone in order for them to show up, does this perhaps provide a space for the advocacy community going forward to make arguments that may actually get more traction around alternatives?
Absolutely. This is perhaps the silver lining here, that we can look at this and basically use this as a pilot project, a test case, whatever you want to call it, to see, is it really necessary to detain all these people? Basically we have a sort of they used to call the military industrial complex. Now, the immigration detention industrial complex, where we have, private contractors, we have state county jails that largely function on the basis of, very high ticket prices for detaining, federal detentions for immigration purposes. This is very costly to the American taxpayer. And is it really necessary? And I think that one of the things that we might find is that there are far less expensive ways that are equally efficient and quite a bit more humane for keeping tabs on people, and we'll find that I think there's a much greater level of compliance on the part of asylum seekers and migrants too, for that matter, than the myth would suggest about people that are absconding and not showing up.
Well, we have just a few minutes left, and I just wanted to turn and just I mean, you already sort of alluded to this when you talked about the way in which the US government and potentially other governments are using COVID-19 as a pretext to actually execute policies that they might have wanted to do otherwise. And I maybe thought you could comment a little bit about how pandemics like we're seeing with COVID-19 or the political protests and civil unrest that have been occurring globally against police brutality and calling for justice for Black Americans can be used by nation states to further erode human rights protections, which then again create conditions for people to need to flee and seek surrogate state protection. I just wanted to, if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, when you introduced me, you mentioned I've been doing this for quite a number of years, which is true, and I've seen sort of the ebb and flow, if you will, of how refugees are stigmatized, and it wasn't. It was very recently. It was actually, in 2015, 2016 was the big, the big refugee crisis, where we saw when he was a candidate for president of the United States, Donald Trump, basically saying that refugees were terrorists, or that there were terrorists among them, that this was the poison skittle, that the refugee resettlement was essentially a Trojan horse that was going to bring terrorists into the United States. And so, you ended up with this this association and pushing fears and prejudices in ways that that scapegoated refugees and harmed refugees generally, by association with something that factually, it was as minuscule numbers as would be with general populations in terms of who actually was committing terrorist acts. And now, ironically, with COVID-19, you've got the United States with the largest number of cases and the largest number of deaths, and shuddering in fear that COVID-19 is going to be brought in by refugees coming in from Central America, where the incidence of COVID-19 is, quite a bit less. And so here again, the facts just don't match up to the rhetoric and to the actions that are taken to prevent refugees from seeking asylum. Now, that migration as a whole has in many respects been suspended or stopped, as a result of COVID-19, and there are legitimate fears of how disease spreads, how pandemic spreads. But here again, I think the main point that we need to be making, and it's the same point that I would make, about terrorism or about any of the other kinds of things that scapegoat people, is to basically say, you take rational steps to minimize risks. We're never going to be 100% risk-free in anything that we do, but there are reasonable risks that you take in order to protect lives, in order to save lives, in order to meet your obligations, and you can make manageable choices if there's the will to do that, and the willingness, in fact, to meet your obligations. I would venture to say your moral obligations as well as your legal ones here, and to basically, if we can manage to do this, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes for a moment, and to think, that it's not a solution to your fear of disease to segregate people into densely packed unsanitary conditions where they're likely to contract the disease as a way of protecting you from that disease. That in itself, I mean, putting aside sending people back to persecution or whatever it may be, is just an illegitimate way of approaching a problem like that. And for one thing, none of us are going to be hermetically sealed in any case. So let's, again, do what's reasonable, take the reasonable precautions that hopefully we're all taking in any case, with protective equipment and safe social distancing and so on and so forth. But let's apply those same principles to refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, and allow them the opportunity to stay safe as well.
Great. Well, you've done a great job at sort of helping our viewers understand some of the problems that refugees have historically faced and are continuing to face under COVID-19. And knowing our viewers, I think that one of the things that they would want to know from you is, well, now that you've helped me understand the problem, what can I do to be part of the solution? So coming from your background in advocacy, what might you impart to our viewers on how they might be part of the solution?
A lot of there are legal obligations, and so the roles of litigation of courts, to order the government to do certain things, is certainly an important part for those people that have the tools to enable them to engage in that form of advocacy, if you want to call it that. But I think, a lot of these are political choices. The government shouldn't be forced by the courts to release people from inhuman and degrading conditions. They ought to choose to do that as a matter of policy. And something like resettlement is, we've never argued that resettlement per se is a human right. You don't have a right to resettle, but it's a very important tool. It's a tool of protection, and it's humane, and it shows engagement with the world. And in terms of what local people can do, many faith-based organizations and others have been involved hands-on in helping refugees to receive them in decent conditions, and to give them a leg up, knowing that many times they are traumatized and experienced great loss, and to help to integrate them so that they actually do have a durable solution, and they meet people. And if there's any fears about the children of refugees becoming terrorists or something at some point, well, if people are fully integrated and they're not, you don't alienate them, then that's the way to, in an organic kind of way, that's the way that you create a safe environment, is by welcoming people and making them feel that they're part of this society, and that it is, with respect to their own cultures, and allowing them the freedom of their expression of their religious beliefs and other cultural points that may be different for the host country, in this case America, the United States, but to be open to that, to be open to different cultures, and at the same time to be welcoming. So I think there's a lot that you can do in your own communities to reach out to immigrant communities, to reach out to marginalized communities of one sort or another, and that would be people with disabilities, and certainly what we're looking at now with Black Lives Matter at the African American community in this country, the Latino communities. So I think there's a particular opportunity and responsibility for people like myself that you can see, that are the sort of the traditionally privileged segments of this society, in terms of race, gender, economic station, however you want to characterize that, to basically say we have to be more fair, and more welcoming and more open in the way that we treat these things. And we have to, again, I'm a nonpartisan organization. I'm trying to be careful not to make a particular political pitch, but basically to elect people who share values that basically recognize that this is an interrelated world, that our responsibilities don't end at our border. Um, and that if you really want to solve problems of injustice and you want law and order, you need to have justice, and you need to treat people in ways that make them feel included as part of the society and not excluded from the society. And I think the more that people can do to be inclusive in a societal way, the better off this and any society will be. And the less conflict and the less action reaction that you end up with, excessive police force or whatever it might be. Hopefully we don't reach that, that point if we can, in a more organic kind of way, a more holistic way, take steps that just in our daily lives and in the way that we treat each other, just treat people who are different respectfully.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill. It was great to have you here and great to have this conversation, and keep up with the fantastic work you and Human Rights Watch are doing around these important issues.
Thank you very much, Erin. Great to talk to you.